We can forgive a man for making a useful thing, as long as he does not admire it. The only excuse for making a useless thing is that he admires it intensely. All art is quite useless.
All men know the use of the useful, but nobody knows the use of the useless. Tao Master Zhuangzi, Section 4 of the Inner Writings. Like much of the text in which it resides, the passage that contains this quotation interrogates the assumptions and societal mores of the civilization in which its author lived. Zhuangzi was responding to the particular challenges and confusions of living in accordance with the way of nature in a bustling and evolving China circa the 4th century before the Common Era. His writing is steeped in references to the culture and famous figures of that time and place. Yet, like that other great ancient Taoist text, the Tao Te Ching, nearly every passage of Zhuangzi's collection rings out with relevance to the modern world. Zhuangzi was concerned with the problem of living well, of living peacefully, harmoniously, that is, in a world gone mad in its obsession with economy, industry, utility, reputation, and practicality. Or that pair of P terms that afflict us today, progress and productivity. Only in seeing past the material usefulness of things, their industrial and economic value, could human beings live in accordance with the way. Only in finding the use of the useless could our souls and our bodies flourish. And, as we all know, there's nothing more useless than art. So, supposing that Zhuangzi is onto something, that human beings are at their best when living in accordance with the way of nature, and that embracing the paradoxical use of the useless invites us into that way, how might art fit into this project? Does every form of art have a different function, every individual work a singular effect? Stanislavski tells us that in general is the enemy of all art, and indeed a lack of specificity will mar a good story, flatten any interpretation, and muddy up a discussion about art. But must we discuss every work on its own terms, or is it fair to talk about what art in general does for us, or what it does within us? I'm Greg Beam, and this is Quite Useless. Welcome to Quite Useless, a podcast about art and its role in our lives. Each episode I take a look at a different topic in the arts, and for this first episode of Season 2, I'm taking a rather broad view, the broadest, you might say. Rather than examining a particular work or a particular artist, I'm asking how art, all art, regardless of form or content, how art works at its most basic level. And what better place to start than with the advice of a Tao master who died almost 2,300 years ago? Zhuangzi's writings are interesting and engaging not only for their philosophical and psychological insights, but because of their artfulness. He delivers these madcap fables, anecdotes, and dialogues, often casting himself or his predecessor Lao Tzu, or various versions of Confucius, as players in scenes that more resemble the postmodern humor of an absurdist playwright like Eugenie Ionesco or even Dr. Seuss than what you might expect from classical Chinese literature. Not that I'm an expert in classical Chinese literature, but as translated by Burton Watson, there's a playfulness and poetry to Zhuangzi's writing. His passages brim with the infectious energy of a good cartoon, comic, or comedy sketch, but never lose sight of their purpose: to wake the reader to a better way of being in the world. Like his Western contemporaries, the Stoic philosophers, Zhuangzi favored mindful engagement with society. He encouraged his students to discharge their duties while retaining a steadfast equanimity and attending principally to their inward state. Other folks down through the ages, however, have responded differently to a similar diagnosis of the ills affecting human civilization, choosing to withdraw from society altogether and live lives of quiet contemplation away from the clamor and corruption of public life. One person who decided that withdrawing from society, at least temporarily, was a requirement for his own self-discovery and spiritual development was the 20th century author, activist, and Trappist monk Thomas Merton. Merton is best known for his eloquent and accessible writings on Christian spirituality and mysticism, notably his memoir The Seven-Story Mountain, which was included in National Review's list of the 100 best nonfiction books of the 20th century. But to those who lived, prayed, and studied with Merton, he was also known as an astute scholar of the arts and humanities, and this makes sense considering his background. His upbringing had more of a humanistic tenor than a religious one. His father was a painter, and a rather good one by Merton's account, who favored a bohemian existence, especially after the untimely death of his wife when Thomas was 6 years old. As a young man, Merton followed his father into the realm of the aesthetic, though his interests tended more toward the literary than the visual. While in boarding school, he took up with a cohort of young writers and himself penned a couple of novels. As a student at Columbia University, though, Merton began to realize that the satisfaction he sought in his aesthetic pursuits continued to elude him, and perhaps always would. While working on a thesis on William Blake, he began to take an interest in Catholic theology, and eventually decided to enter the priesthood. After a series of false starts, he entered the abbey at Gethsemane as a novice monk. Even as Merton became more deeply invested in his spiritual pursuits, however, it's clear that the practice of art remained very important to him. His writing is not only lucid, articulate, and complex, it makes elegant and extensive use of conceptual and sensory motifs, metaphors, and other literary devices. One has the sense in reading Merton that had he not entered the monastery, he might have developed into a novelist or poet of some renown. After his brother John Paul was killed in the Second World War, Merton wrote a poem in his memory, which he included in The Seven-Story Mountain. "Sweet brother, if I do not sleep, my eyes are flowers for your tomb. And if I cannot eat my bread, my fasts shall live like willows where you died. If in the heat I find no water for my thirst shall turn to springs for you, poor traveler. Where, in what desolate and smoky country, lies your poor body, lost and dead? And in what landscape of disaster has your unhappy spirit lost its road? Come, in my labor find a resting place, and in my sorrows lay your head. Or rather take my life and blood, and buy yourself a better bed. Or take my breath and take my death, and buy yourself a better rest. When all the men of war are shot, and flags have fallen into dust, your cross and mine shall tell men still, Christ died on each, for both of us. For in the wreckage of your April, Christ lies slain, and Christ weeps in the ruins of my spring, the money of whose tears shall fall into your weak and friendless hand, and buy you back to your own land, the silence of whose tears shall fall like bells upon your alien tomb. Hear them, and come. They call you home." In spite of withdrawing from the world, Merton was still using art to live with the realities of the world. He was still seeking out the use of the useless. In the mid-1960s, not long before his untimely death at the age of 53, Merton recorded a series of lectures on the poetry of Rainer Maria Rilke. You can find recordings of these lectures under the title God Speaks to Each of Us. Merton had briefly taught literature before becoming a monk, and he clearly had a knack for communicating complex ideas in straightforward, understandable language. He lectures in a familiar tone, without affectation or bombast, injecting his talks with ample doses of humor. The course is replete with illuminating observations, including some trenchant analyses of Rilke's poems. But the part of the lectures that has remained with me the most doesn't have to do specifically with Rilke. Rather, it's a set of preparatory remarks about art that Merton makes in the first lecture in the series. Merton guides his students through the way that we ideally experience a work of art, a symphony, a painting, a poem, whatever. The first thing that happens, of course, is that we perceive the work through our senses. What happens next, according to Merton, is that the impression made on our senses is projected inward, acting upon our imagination. Here, Merton makes an important distinction. By imagination, he doesn't mean the idle daydreaming faculty that the young monks use to make mental movies during Sunday prayers. Rather, he means a deep contemplative dimension of the mind, the same dimension, and this is critical, in which the artist conceived the work. For Merton, the true, deep, vivid experience of perceiving art is undifferentiated from the experience the artist has in creating it. He says that when art is working as it should, it turns the person beholding it into an artist. The viewer, listener, or reader actually creates, or recreates, strictly speaking, the work in their own imagination. This recreative act points to a new level of being, to new vistas of consciousness that had previously been unavailable. As we engage with art through this process of communion, understanding, and recreation, our minds blossom and expand, and the intelligible world unfolds before us. Merton writes in his book, No Man is an Island, in an aesthetic experience, in the creation or the contemplation of a work of art, the psychological conscience is able to attain some of its highest and most perfect fulfillments. Art enables us to find ourselves and lose ourselves at the same time. The mind that responds to the intellectual and spiritual values that lie hidden in a poem, a painting, or a piece of music discovers a spiritual vitality that lifts it above itself, takes it out of itself, and makes it present to itself on a level of being that it did not know it could ever achieve. In Merton's view, the aesthetic experience, whether arrived at through creation or contemplation, mirrors the path of spiritual growth. The aesthetic experience and the spiritual experience function in essentially the same way, just at different levels. This is why he holds art to be such a critical feature of human experience. When a work of art truly engages us, it acts as a gateway to the divine. Of course, this is not how we are often taught to address works of art, as Merton is quick to point out. All too often, we learn to catalog, analyze, and assess works, determining what we like or say we like based on its reputation. Rather than having an absorbing personal encounter in which we allow the work to work on us, inwardly stirring our own creative faculties, we regard it coolly, objectively, as an observer of its features rather than as a participant in what it's doing. We regard it rather than communicating with it, scrutinize it rather than sensing it. Many of us, quite frankly, are in the habit of thinking so much about art that we do very little in the way of actually experiencing it. We go to museums and galleries because they're bastions of culture, scouring the placards for information even as our eyes glaze over at the paintings themselves. We study Dostoevsky because we are told how deep he is, which must mean there is something deficient in us if we haven't read and understood his work. We see an endless string of Shakespeare productions because we imagine his work is somehow more ennobling than 21st century drama, even if we're only pretending to understand all the nuances of the language. And I'll admit that I have studied Shakespeare fairly extensively and performed his work professionally, and I am still only pretending to understand all of the nuances in the language. We listen to classical music on the local public radio station because that's what smart people listen to, right? None of these experiences has anything to do with what art is meant to do, how the artist means to connect with their audience, and the role that art is supposed to play in our lives. It doesn't matter how brilliant a piece of writing is if it stimulates no thought in the reader. It doesn't matter how elegant the lines in a painting are or how vivid its colors if the viewer is not absorbed in its beauty. This is what we really mean when we say that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Not that beauty is relative, but that it resides in our perception of a thing, not in the thing itself. The objective characteristics of a work of art don't matter so much as the subjective experience the work inspires. If art doesn't involve us almost as a co-creator or a recreator, then it's not doing what it's supposed to do. Thomas Merton was keen on the idea that this subjective phenomenon is the true purpose of art, the very essence of the aesthetic experience. So keen that he tells his students he would rather have them gaze with genuine interest upon a well-designed package of candy than look dryly on great objects of art that stir nothing in them. If Merton were alive today, I'm curious what he would have to say about the throngs of tourists who jockey to position themselves for better cell phone photos of the glass covering the Mona Lisa. When I made the first season of this podcast, I covered a lot of topics, but as I was working on it, it occurred to me that what I was really after was a unified or general theory of art. A philosophy of art, if you will. Much has been written and said about the unique characteristics of various art forms, and certainly individual schools and works of art, what defines them and distinguishes among them, and how they may be blended together, rearranged, or deconstructed. But I'm more curious what it is that they all share. Why the experience of listening to a great jazz solo feels so closely related to the experience of reading a great story, even though formally and materially these two things are completely different. They're constructed differently, they work on our senses differently. So how is it that both of them seem to work upon the same aspect of the mind and spirit? In spite of Stanislavski's insistence that in general is the enemy of all art, there seems to be something about the aesthetic experience that pertains across forms, genres, styles, and sensory modalities. Thomas Merton's description of the aesthetic experience, though it's only a brief sketch of a complex phenomenon, seems to me to strike near the heart of the question. At the very least, he captures something critical, something essential, that is often left out or minimized in arts education. And this is a topic that's very important to me because it's what I do for a living. A great deal of emphasis is typically placed on knowledge, comprehension, various forms of artistic literacy, familiarity with a canon of great works, understanding a work's cultural context and implications, and that most prized of goals for the student, appreciation. Rather less emphasis, in my experience, is placed on teaching students to encounter works of art in a way that will allow them to penetrate the dimensions of our consciousness they are targeting. As a teacher, I have sometimes been guilty myself of overstressing the awareness of certain classic works, along with an understanding of their meaning, when I know that what they mean may not be as important as what they do. In his poem, It Ain't What You Do, It's What It Does to You, writer Simon Armitage offers up a handful of thrills that he has never experienced, contrasting them with the simple thrills he has had. I have not toyed with a parachute cord, he writes, while perched on the lip of a light aircraft, but I held the wobbly head of a boy at the day center and stroked his fat hands. In 5 crystalline stanzas, Armitage offers up a brief series of such comparisons, expressing how it is the subjective quality of an experience that matters, what he calls at the end of the poem simply, that sense of something else. That feeling, I mean. He compares bohemian adventures and visits to the great monuments of the world with the relatively quotidian events of his own life, suggesting that the latter is no less elevating and sublime than the former. Because it ain't what you do. It's what it does to you. For my part, I have not heard Renee Fleming's coloratura massage the air at the Met, but I have had a friend play a solo for me in an apartment overlooking the slope on 4th Street. The objective features of a work of art don't matter so much as the subjective experience it inspires. I have not seen that gossamer veil floating light as air over those half-smiling lips, among the multitudes teeming to catch a glimpse. But I have seen rough lanes of charcoal flown across a page in imitation of the other young person posing there. A simple sketch may be as great as the Mona Lisa if it triggers a spinal shiver and a heightening or deepening of consciousness. I have not read the epic song of Ilium or the long tale of one hero's return home from Trojan soil, but I have stood behind a storefront in Chicago with a Midwest bard telling of breaking bread with men who turned out to be thieves. It ain't what you do. It's what it does to you. It isn't what a work of art is. It's how it works in you. In perhaps the most memorable moment of Ken Burns' documentary miniseries Jazz, the legendary composer, pianist, and bandleader Duke Ellington is asked by an interviewer where he gets his ideas from. This question is a bit of a cliché in artist interviews. You can find plenty of accounts of authors saying this is the question they are most often asked and are least eager to answer. Harlan Ellison, who passed last summer, developed the cheeky habit of responding that his ideas come from Poughkeepsie. Ellington's response is more generous, illustrative, and beautiful than Ellison's.
Where did you get your ideas from?
Your ideas? Oh, man, I got a million dreams. That's all I do is dream all the time.
I thought you played piano.
No, this is not piano. This is dreaming. That's dreaming.
This is not piano. This is dreaming. I don't think I've encountered a more succinct expression of the aesthetic experience. And it strikes me that Ellington was speaking just as much to the process of taking in music or any art as he was to the process of making it. This picks up on where I left off with Thomas Merton. When art, whether it be an image, a movie, a book, or a piece of music, is working the way it's supposed to, the audience shares in the experience of creator. They enter into the dream of the dreamer. The Japanese novelist and perennial Nobel Prize hopeful Haruki Murakami stated the dreamlike nature of artistic creation even more explicitly in his acceptance speech for the 2011 International Catalunya Prize. The writer's work is the dreaming of dreams, he tells us, but we have even more important work, to share those dreams with everyone. If one does not possess that sense of sharing, one cannot be a novelist. Murakami, however, wasn't content simply to make the comparison between writing and dreaming. He goes on to explain the importance of this dreaming and sharing process in cultural and historical terms. Seeming to channel John Lennon, he says, "If all of you in Catalonia, and all of us in Japan, could become unrealistic dreamers, if we could come together to create a spiritual community that unfolds beyond the limits of borders and cultures, what a wonderful thing that would be. I believe that would be the starting point for the rebirth of all of us who have passed through assorted terrible disasters and terrors of unmitigated sadness over recent years. We should not be afraid to dream dreams. We should not allow the dogs of misfortune named efficiency and convenience to overtake us. We must be unrealistic dreamers who step forward with a strong stride. A person must die one day and disappear from this earth, but humanity will remain. That humanity will continue on without end. We must first believe in the power of humanity." It's worth noting that Murakami was delivering these remarks 3 months to the day after the nuclear disaster at Fukushima. A significant portion of his speech is dedicated to highlighting the horrific irony that Japan, the only nation to have suffered the cataclysm of nuclear weapons attacks and endured the generational fallout among the survivors of those strikes, would continue to embrace the catastrophic power of nuclear energy. Murakami was talking about dreaming, but he was not making these comments wistfully or whimsically. He wasn't calling for a flight from reality. This isn't escapism. This is the truest and deepest and most human kind of engagement that we have, to be able to dream and to share those dreams with others. Dreaming isn't just a pleasant way to pass the time. It's the best means we have to pass on our vision and our values, our individual and shared experiences, to create a bridge between the past, the present, and the future. Dreaming is the best way we have to make sure that our past traumas do not ruin us. that our history is not a prison, and that our future is not a dark cloud into which we find ourselves inexorably hurtling. In the most famous passage from his writings, Tao Master Zhuangzi talks about a dream he had in which he was a butterfly. Upon waking, he asked himself how he knew that he was Zhuangzi who had dreamed he was a butterfly, and not the butterfly now dreaming he is Zhuangzi. Now, this might sound like the kind of question you'd hear in a bachelor pad basement redolent of herbal refreshments, but like much of Zhuangzi's work, it comes with a healthy dose of humor. I suspect that what he meant to express was the power of our ability to dream, rather than a deep metaphysical skepticism. Edgar Allan Poe wrote that those who dream by day are cognizant of many things which escape those who dream only by night. T.E. Lawrence tells us, those who dream by night in the dusty recesses of their minds wake up to the day to find it was vanity. But the dreamers of the day are dangerous men, for they may act their dreams with open eyes to make it possible. Gloria Steinem assures us that dreaming is a form of planning. According to Akira Kurosawa, man is a genius when he is dreaming, and Stephen King puts it plainly, telling us, those who don't dream, who don't have any kind of imaginative life, they must go nuts. I can't imagine that. This is not piano. This is not a piece of paper or a hunk of clay or a canvas or a computer. This is not a podcast. It's dreaming. It's everything we share and everything we aspire to be. The gift of our imagination, the gift of dreaming, may be the greatest power that we human beings possess, and art is the bridge between our dreams and the world. This episode of Quite Useless was written, recorded, produced, performed, edited, mixed, and mastered by me, Greg Beam. I also made all the music. In case you're wondering where I got the quote that you hear at the beginning of each episode, that's from the introduction to Oscar Wilde's novel, A Picture of Dorian Gray. Not a great novel in my view, but the introduction is pretty cool. You can find Quite Useless on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. Am I the only person who uses Google Play? I feel like I am. I'll be back in a few weeks with some thoughts on the unholy union of art and commerce, and then I'll be releasing a new episode every 3 or 4 weeks thereafter for the next several months. Subscribe, download, enjoy. I'm Greg Beam, and I very much hope you'll join me for more Quite Useless, but oh so dreamy adventures.